A voice in the crowd cut through the steady hum of the city's evening rush. The sun was setting behind the skyline, casting a warm golden hue over the busy streets, where people hurried by, too absorbed in their own worlds to notice much around them. In the midst of this, a boy named Eli, a young black child with dirt smeared on his cheeks, stood quietly on the corner, his hands stretched out, seeking anything he could get. Eli had long since learned not to expect much, maybe a few coins or some leftover food. Hunger had become a constant ache, and the sting of disdainful glances had numbed him. His makeshift bed, a tattered piece of cardboard, was tucked under his arm as he moved through the crowd, barely noticeable, almost invisible. His voice was hoarse from a day spent calling out to passers-by, but he pressed on. As he scanned the crowd, his eyes landed on a well-dressed woman. Her clothes gleamed in the fading light, and the rings on her fingers sparkled as she adjusted her designer handbag. Eli's heart skipped. This woman, maybe she would help him. "Excuse me, ma'am," Eli whispered, stepping closer and extending his hand. "I haven't eaten in days. Could you spare a few coins for food?" The woman's gaze fell on him, and she recoiled, her face twisting in disgust. "Don't touch me, you filthy thing," she snapped, pulling back, her voice sharp. "This coat costs more than you'll ever make in your miserable life." Eli's shoulders slumped, but he stood his ground, his hands trembling slightly. "Please," he whispered, "I can work for you. Clean your car. Anything. Just something to eat." But the woman's disdain only deepened. "Work?" she sneered. "Look at you. Dirty, stinking, probably covered in lice. People like you just want to beg and steal from decent folks like me?" She spat, her voice laced with venom. A small crowd began to gather, some people pulling out their phones to record the scene. Eli's heart raced, but he didn't want to show weakness. His stomach growled loudly, but he ignored it, not wanting to appear vulnerable. "You don't know me," he said softly, his voice surprisingly steady. "You have no idea what I've been through." The woman glared at him, her voice cutting like a knife. "You probably tried to rob me, huh? Kids like you are all the same. Part of some gang, no doubt." Eli's face flushed with shame, but he blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. He stumbled back, but his resolve stayed firm. Just then, a deep, calm voice cut through the crowd. "Enough!" The crowd turned, and they saw a tall man, impeccably dressed, walking toward them. His presence was commanding, and the woman faltered, flustered by the interruption. "I was just teaching him a lesson," the woman muttered, trying to justify herself. "Beggars need to know their place." The man ignored her completely, instead focusing on Eli. His gaze softened as he looked at the boy's exhausted face. Reaching into his pocket, the man pulled out a folded bill and placed it gently into Eli's hand. Eli's eyes widened in disbelief. It was more money than he'd ever held at once in his life. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The man nodded and gave the woman a piercing look, silencing her. "Today," he said calmly, his voice firm but not unkind, "you've shown everyone who you really are." The man gave Eli a final, soft smile before turning to walk away, disappearing into the crowd. As he left, something inside Eli shifted. The warmth of the man's kindness planted a small seed of hope deep inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt as though he might have a future beyond just surviving. That night, Eli found a quiet spot beneath a bridge, clutching the bill tightly. His mind raced with thoughts of what he could do next. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wanted to try. The next morning, as dawn broke, Eli awoke to a new feeling, something unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. He rose to his feet, walking with purpose, the folded bill still clutched in his hand. He passed by a bakery where the smell of fresh bread and pastries filled the air. People walked in and out, holding warm bags of food. Eli was about to step inside when a voice hissed from behind him. "Don't even think about it," a voice warned. Eli turned to find another street kid, about his age, dressed in a torn coat, looking at him with wary eyes. "Who are you?" Eli asked, surprised. The girl crossed her arms, eyeing him with a mix of suspicion and caution. "Name's Tasha," she said. "If you know what's good for you, you'll stay away from places like this." Eli frowned. "I just wanted to buy something to eat," Tasha scoffed. "Not here, you won't. These fancy places call the cops the second they see someone like us. Trust me, they won't let you in." Eli hesitated, but Tasha's words rang true. He hadn't thought about that. His stomach churned with both hunger and embarrassment. "Come on," Tasha said, giving him a small nod. "There's a food cart a few blocks away. They won't look twice at you there." The two of them walked through narrow alleyways, heading toward a quiet part of town. After a short while, they reached the food cart, where a vendor served sandwiches to anyone in need. Eli ordered one, and they sat by a fountain, sharing the meal in silence. Between bites, Eli glanced at Tasha. "Why'd you help me?" he asked, curious. Tasha shrugged, chewing thoughtfully. "Someone helped me once. I figured I'd pay it forward," she said, "but don't get used to it. Out here, people will smile at you one minute and take everything you've got the next." Eli absorbed her words, feeling their weight. "What should I do then?" he asked, unsure. Tasha looked him in the eye, her expression hardening. "Make a plan. Lay low. Find a way off these streets," she said. "This life isn't meant for anyone, but if you're stuck here, you learn fast." Eli nodded slowly, feeling something stir inside him. For the first time, he felt a flicker of resolve. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he had to start somewhere. As they finished their meal, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that Simon, this stranger who had shown him such kindness, was somehow connected to the path ahead of him. Days passed, and Eli couldn't stop thinking about Simon. The man's face, his calm yet intense demeanor, and the way he had helped him. Everything about that encounter stayed with Eli. He had never met anyone like Simon before. One afternoon, while waiting near the park for Tasha, Eli spotted him. Simon, dressed in a tailored suit, walked with purpose toward a sleek black car. Eli's heart skipped a beat. He was torn between running to him or staying hidden, unsure of what to do. But before Eli could make a decision, Tasha appeared from behind, her eyes narrowing as she watched Simon. Without a word, she moved closer, her hand slipping into her coat pocket. Eli's eyes widened when he saw the glint of a small, sharp blade. "Tasha, don't!" Eli whispered urgently, grabbing her arm. Tasha spun around, her expression a mix of surprise and frustration. "We could take his wallet, Eli. We'd be set for days." Eli shook his head firmly. "He's a good person. He helped me." Tasha's eyes flashed with disbelief. "You're kidding, right? He's not going to do anything for us. People like him don't care about people like us." Eli looked at her with resolve in his eyes. "He's different. I know he is." Tasha stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine, but don't expect people like him to save you again." She reluctantly put the blade back into her pocket. As they watched Simon walk away, Eli felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. He was grateful for Tasha's understanding, but part of him still felt like he might have made the wrong choice. Later that evening, as Eli sat by the fountain again, he saw Simon. The man was walking alone, looking tired but determined. Their eyes met, and for a moment Eli hesitated. Then, as if guided by some unseen force, he stood and walked toward Simon. "Are you all right?" Simon asked, his voice gentle, as though he had been waiting for Eli. Eli nodded, a lump forming in his throat. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Simon studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I'm fine, Eli, but I'm glad you came." Just then, a sleek black car pulled up beside them. A woman in a sharp, expensive dress rolled down the window, her eyes cold and piercing. "There you are, Simon," she said, her voice laced with impatience. "Are you done with your little stroll?" Simon turned to her, his expression hardening. "Yes, Amelia. I was just talking to a friend." Amelia's gaze shifted to Eli, and her expression twisted with disdain. "Friend?" she scoffed. "I don't know why you waste time with people like him." Eli felt a familiar sting in his chest, but he stood tall. "Maybe not, but you don't deserve to be here either," he said, his voice steady despite the humiliation. "Simon trusted you, and you betrayed him." Amelia's face contorted in anger, and she lunged at Simon, but Eli stepped in between them. She shoved him aside, her strength surprising him. But before she could do more, the door of the car opened. A group of police officers stepped out, and the atmosphere in the air shifted immediately. The officers moved swiftly, and within moments, Amelia was being led away, her face twisted in fury. Eli stood, watching as she was escorted to the police car. The weight of the situation sank in, and he could hardly believe what had just happened. As the police car drove away, Eli stood in stunned silence. The night air felt different, heavier somehow. His heart raced as he watched the officers lead Amelia to the car, the weight of what had just happened slowly sinking in. Simon had trusted him. Eli had helped him expose Amelia's betrayal, but now everything felt uncertain. "You did good, Eli," Simon said, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. "I couldn't have done it without you." Eli felt a wave of warmth spread through him, but a part of him still felt lost. For so long, he had only been focused on surviving. Now with this sudden shift in his life, he didn't know what to do next. Simon had offered him something that felt almost impossible, a chance to escape this life. "Are you going to be okay?" Eli asked, his voice quiet but filled with concern. Simon smiled softly. "I'll be fine. I'll make sure Amelia pays for what she's done." His expression turned serious as he placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "But you? What about you? What will you do now?" Eli didn't know how to answer. It was as though the moment he had been waiting for his entire life had arrived. And yet he felt paralyzed by uncertainty. He had never had a plan. He had never dared to dream. All he had known was surviving the next day. And now he was being asked to step into a new life. Simon noticed the hesitation in Eli's eyes and gave him a small, encouraging smile. "Don't worry, Eli. We'll figure it out together. You don't have to do it alone." The next few days passed in a blur for Eli. He followed Simon to his mansion, where Simon had started making arrangements to ensure Amelia's betrayal would not go unpunished. Despite the wealth surrounding Simon, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Simon was a man of means, but he seemed burdened, like something dark was hanging over him. It was late one evening when Simon shared his suspicions. "Amelia has control over everything. I can't escape her, not without risking everything I've worked for." His face tightened, and for the first time, Eli saw the cracks in Simon's composed exterior. "I think she's trying to poison me, Eli. Every time I eat something she prepares, I feel sick." Eli was shocked. "You have to get away from her. Now." Simon looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and relief. "I don't know how, Eli. She's involved in everything." Eli clenched his fists, determination flashing in his eyes. "I'll help you. We'll figure this out together. You deserve to be free." Over the next few days, Eli and Tasha worked with Simon to gather evidence against Amelia. They followed her, watched her closely, and found that she was meeting with shady figures who seemed to be helping her gain control of Simon's wealth. One night, Tasha overheard Amelia talking to one of her contacts at a cafe. "Once I transfer everything to my name," Amelia said in a low voice, "he won't have anything left. He'll be completely at my mercy." When Tasha shared the information with Eli, they knew they had to act fast. The next night, they followed Amelia to a large mansion on the outskirts of the city. They snuck inside and found her in a study, her desk covered with papers. She was on the phone with someone, discussing plans to take control of Simon's assets. Eli and Tasha quietly snapped photos of the documents before slipping out, careful not to make a sound. The next morning, Eli rushed to Simon's mansion, holding the evidence. His heart raced as he handed the photos to Simon. "This is everything. You can use this to prove what she's doing." The next evening, Simon and Eli arrived at the mansion. The air was thick with tension as they waited in the dimly lit room. Eli could feel his palms sweating, his heart pounding in his chest. Tonight, everything would come to a head. "Are you sure about this?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Simon nodded, his face set in determination. "I have to face her. Amelia has destroyed enough of my life already. It's time to end this." The door opened and Amelia entered, her sharp eyes immediately finding Eli. She sneered as she glanced at Simon. "So, this is how it ends? With a street rat and his silly little evidence?" Eli stood tall, refusing to let her words break him. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "You thought you could control everything, but you were wrong." Amelia's eyes narrowed and she moved toward Simon. "You really think you can stop me? You're nothing, both of you. You're just obstacles." You've already lost, Simon said calmly, his voice unwavering. The truth is out, and you'll pay for what you did. Amelia scoffed, turning her gaze to the papers Simon was holding. You think these will change anything? I'll never let you take what's mine. You can't win. Before Simon could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Amelia froze, her face going pale. The door burst open, and the police stormed in. Amelia Cartwright, you're under arrest for fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit crimes against Mr. Simon Whitmore. Amelia's face twisted in fury as the officers approached her. No, this isn't over, she shouted. You'll never get away with this. As the officers cuffed her and escorted her out of the room, Simon turned to Eli, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. It's over, Eli. It's finally over. Eli looked at Simon, feeling a sense of accomplishment, but also a pang of sadness. It's really over, isn't it? Simon nodded, then paused, his eyes softening. For me, it is. But what about you, Eli? What's next for you? Eli didn't know. For the first time in his life, he was faced with a future that was wide open, full of possibilities. He could choose a new path, one that wasn't about surviving, but about living. I don't know yet, Eli said with a small smile, his voice filled with quiet hope. But I think I'll figure it out. Days passed and the weight of the past began to feel lighter for Eli. He had faced the darkness of the streets, survived betrayal, and helped someone escape a controlling, toxic relationship. But now, for the first time, he was looking forward to something more. Simon had made sure Eli was set up with a place to stay, a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was small, but it was a start. For Eli, it felt like more than just four walls and a roof. It felt like a new beginning. One evening, as Eli sat on his small balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below, he thought about how far he had come. He had a future now, one he had never imagined possible. He could go to school, get a job, maybe even make a life for himself. Just then, there was a knock on the door. Eli stood up, his heart racing slightly. He wasn't used to visitors, not yet. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see Simon standing there. I thought I'd drop by, Simon said with a warm smile. How are you doing? I'm good, really good, actually, Eli replied, his voice steady. It's still strange, though. I keep thinking that something's going to happen, that maybe I'll wake up back on the streets. Simon chuckled softly, stepping into the apartment. I get that. It's hard to shake those old habits. But you're not going back there. You've made it out, and you're not alone anymore. Eli smiled, the weight in his chest easing a little. I've never had someone say that to me before. Simon placed a hand on Eli's shoulder, his eyes filled with understanding. Well, now you know. You've got a lot of people who care about you, Eli, and you have the power to change your own future. For the first time in a long while, Eli felt truly seen, truly valued. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, and he was ready for whatever came next. Thank you, Eli said softly, his voice thick with emotion. You've changed my life, Simon. I don't know how to repay you. Simon shook his head. You don't owe me anything, Eli. Just live your life. That's all I want. As Simon left the apartment, Eli stood by the window, watching the lights of the city. For the first time, the future didn't seem so intimidating. He was ready to take the first step into it, no matter how uncertain it might be. And as the night stretched on, Eli made a promise to himself, a promise to embrace the unknown and to never forget the kindness that had brought him this far.